Hi. Well, here it is. It's Tuesday evening, and I just thought I'd make a few remarks about Everson and Lemon before we had our Zoom meeting tomorrow. Excuse me, on the assumption that this Zoom meeting comes off without difficulty. Um, Look, just a few things, and then, of course, we'll talk more about it tomorrow. At the same time, I don't want the Zoom class to be class. I've heard from too many of you that too many of you can't attend. So it's largely, I think, to be thought of more like an office hour where whatever that does go on is also that which can be repeated and reiterated at a later date. I don't want anyone to have any anxiety about missing the Zoom class. All right. Some opening remarks about this second tier, this second strand of the freedom of religion cases. Here, the worry is, as you know, just the other way. It's not protecting the religious believer from an overly intrusive state or federal law. It is protecting the average or everyday citizen from the government wrongly supporting, or to use the legally relevant term here, establishing a religion. It's an interesting feature of these cases that any taxpayer has standing to bring them. You don't see that in the religious free exercise cases. If Miss Sherbert doesn't complain, if the parents of the Amish children don't complain, if the Native Americans don't complain, there's no case. But in the establishment cases, every one of us has a legitimate interest in making sure that our taxpayer dollars, our elected government, because in some cases, like the school prayer cases, it's not so much money, but simply some other act of government endorsement that causes the worry. But the main point, it's a side point, but it's an interesting one. In the establishment cases, the party bringing the case can be anyone. This is, as far as I know, nowhere else true. The party bringing the case must be what's called the party in interest, the person who's actually, forced to go to school or going to lose her unemployment benefits, or in the case of Smith, lose their unemployment benefits, or perhaps in some other case, face jail time. Here, every taxpayer has what's called standing to see that this norm, this value, this aspiration of a separation between church and state is respected. And we're just going to say a few things about these two important cases, which in a sense give the framework for what follows. And then we'll go on to the somewhat more subtle and certainly more contemporary cases of Agostini, Zobrist, and Zalman. Okay, so in Everson, this is a late 40s case, 1947 case, but it articulates a distinction that is crucial to the establishment cases. The state of New Jersey, as you know, has a plan to subsidize transportation costs for parents, and this subsidy is extended not only to the children of parents who attend public schools, but to the children who attend religious schools. And that means, and no one denies this, every subsidy can make a small difference. So it might even well be the case that there are some parents on the fence as to whether or not to send their child to a religious school. I'm just going to say a Catholic school, because most of these private schools at the time in New Jersey would have been Catholic schools. And we'll see this in the Zalman case as well. The overwhelming majority of these schools are Catholic schools. The Catholic Church runs a great many of them. They're often extremely competitively priced. This comes up with great power in the Zellman case. And the reason they're competitively priced is the faculty very highly trained and highly educated faculty are often, nuns and priests who work for free. So they occupy this unusual place in the American educational savannah. But in any event, some parents would undoubtedly be influenced by this additional subsidy for the with respect to the costs they would otherwise incur were they to send their child to a religious school. In other words, it can't be denied that at least in some cases, this subsidy might make the difference between whether a student did or did not attend a religious institution, a religious school. Nevertheless, the court draws a very clear distinction, and I think it's the right one, between a benefit that's offered to the school and a benefit that's offered to the students. As the court says, I think with great, almost wit, what are we going to do? Not send the fire department to a religious school if the school is on fire, not have the police handle the crossing at a dangerous intersection if the child is crossing from one side to the other to get to a religious school. Are we to say that the religious school isn't to, or the students who go to a religious school aren't to be the beneficiaries of government policies that are given everywhere else? When there's a student discount in a museum or a student discount on the bus, nobody says, well, what school are you going to? It can only be if you're going to a public school that you get this discount. This is ridiculous. If we want to support students, then it's got to be a matter of indifference whether or not students then exercise their free exercise right to attend a religious school or not. And I'm going to make a small point that might be of interest to some of you. It's not crucial at this point, but this is the way in which the distinction between students and institutions is very important and hooks on to the free exercise jurisprudence we've already seen. If you were to say to a student that you can only get this subsidy if you go to a public school, you're essentially putting them in a position like that of Ms. Sherbert. You're saying you can either get this benefit to which you'd otherwise be entitled to and forsake your religious convictions, or act on your religious convictions and not get the benefit. And this, of course, would be intolerable. I don't want to go down this road too far because I want to focus on the establishment jurisprudence, which is just all about making a distinction between the student on one hand and the institution on the other. And the idea is if you're giving it to the student, it's the student. And then if the student wants to exercise his or her free exercise right to use that benefit to go to a religious school, that's got to be fine. You're going to see this over and over again when we take up the more contemporary cases about whether a student who needs deaf-mute student needs an interpreter, or a student who needs remedial education, where these are provided by the government, has a right to these things, even if he or she is in a religious institution. And on the whole, my view is this is a pretty reasonable and stable distinction that the court makes in Everson. It's not always easy to see which side of this distinction the legislation is appropriately categorized as being on when we get to the Zellman case. But the fundamental point behind the distinction seems to me undeniable. There's nothing wrong with giving the students a benefit, which they then might decide to use when exercising their constitutionally protected right to pursue their religious free exercise. The benefit is to the person. The person can take that benefit as they are entitled to do to a secular or a religious context. So that's the fundamental point behind Everson. It's a very important case, but it's not a terribly complicated one. It stands for the distinction between the students on one hand and the church or the religious institution on the other. The government may unquestionably provide benefits to its citizens. And if some subset of its citizens decide to use that benefit in a religious context, That can't be objectionable. If it were, you'd be kind of backing into a Sherbert situation where the citizen would be forced to choose between the benefit and religious expression. So that's that bit of establishment ruling. That's the congruence between what we say about the establishment clause in this context and religious free exercise. Now, to a somewhat more interesting, more complicated case, that of Lemon. And it's interesting not just for what the case sort of says explicitly, but for what's in the background that isn't said. You got to look at the legislation that's here being challenged. What is this legislation? Well, it would be a lot of fun if we were in a class now and we went into all the details about what's in this legislation. They combine the Pennsylvania and the Rhode Island statutes. They're a little different, but they're fundamentally congruent. And you have to ask yourself, so what's going on? In both cases, the state is willing to give to these religious institutions a fair bit of money if they will teach additional secular subjects, teach more math, geography. I'll say history, but of course history becomes a little less neutral than something like math or geography. But all right, let's just say something like modern European history and so forth. And the point is that, well, not the point, but this legislation constrains the project in all kinds of interesting and intelligent ways. The religious institution must use the very same textbooks that are being used in the non-religious public school system. The religious institution must use faculty that are not teaching religious subjects at the same time. Even though the legislation provides for a supplement to the religious instructor's salary, the supplement cannot make it the case that the religious instructor earns more than a public school teacher. Very unlikely in light of what I've just told you. It's very unlikely that the religious instructor's salary is within 15% of a public school teacher's salary to begin with. But anyway, the legislation says, whatever, it can't go beyond. In no way can this legislation make it the case that the religious instructor earns more than his public school counterpart. In no case can the religious instructor use a different book than his public school counterpart. In no case can the instructor in the religious institution be teaching something like theology or, St. Thomas Aquinas's last works, or how to make sense of the various apologetics of the late church fathers, or anything like that. There's got to be a kind of guarantee that even though this is happening at a religious institution, it's essentially as much as possible like what would happen were these courses taught in a public school. And you have to ask yourself, why is the state doing this? Why is the state giving these parochial schools this money, this support, in order to teach these secular subjects? Now, I'm just speculating, but I think this is just one of these classic cases where the legislature just can't resist piggybacking on this pre-existing labor force in order to take up some of the, the population of school-age children that would otherwise entirely be their responsibility. So I think for some parents, sending their child to a private religious school, they balk at it because they hesitate, because they fear, to some extent rightly, the child won't get as strong an education in the secular subjects as he or she would in the public school. So the legislature says, yeah, indeed, let's make sure that they would get a very strong education in the parochial school. Why would they do this? Why are they making the religious school a kind of reasonable competitor to the public school? Why? Why does almost everything that happens in this country happen? Money, of course, money. It's so much cheaper to do this than to build another public school or hire 10 more teachers. If you have, say, 10% of your students in these schools and you can raise it to 15 or 20, parents think, yeah, what the heck? This is fine. We're kind of attracted to the idea of this kind of small classroom, a little bit more discipline. We worry about the absence of secular education being as strong. The public sector steps in, makes it stronger, makes it a more appealing place to go. This is so much cheaper than, handling the increase in population that otherwise requires hiring more teachers, perhaps even building another school. It's a classic case where the government tries to deputize or annex a pre-existing workforce, in a way that makes perfect sense. But these guys, they thought it through. They know, they've read the Constitution, or at least some of their staff has, and they know very well there's an establishment problem. So they really think it out. All right, the books have to be the same books. The teacher can't be teaching a course in religion at the same time. The salaries can't be made such that they exceed what the public school teacher gets. I think there are some other additional elements. You'll have to read the case. I don't remember, but it doesn't really matter. What I love about this case is this: the thoughtfulness of the legislation, the very fact that they obviously knew they'd be challenged on establishment grounds, and they crafted the legislation to show over and over again, don't worry, they're going to be separate. Sure, there's going to be Father Mackenzie teaching geography, but so what? The book's the same book as it is in PS 40. Father Mackenzie isn't allowed to teach, doctrinal apologetics the same semester. He's not allowed to get more money than he would make were he teaching in a public school, et cetera, et cetera. All these worries have been woven in to the legislation. And the court says, aha, that's the problem. To make sure all these considerations are enforced requires too much supervision. There'd have to be a kind of auditor or overseer or supervisor coming into these churches, making sure that the salary cap wasn't exceeded, making sure that Father Mackenzie really isn't teaching a religious subject, making sure that there really aren't any kinds of porous overlaps between the teaching of the secular subject and the business of the parochial school, which is absolutely, unquestionably, and legitimately the promulgation of a faith. And so the court says, to make sure this legislation works is to violate the Establishment Clause, because you'd have, and here's the word, you'll never forget it, the phrase, excessive entanglement. For this legislation to be appropriately enacted, we'd have to have the kind of oversight and supervision that fosters the kind of entanglement between the government on one hand and the church on the other that the founding fathers, or our constitutional norms, just are determined to avoid. The very sensitivity of the legislation is its undoing. And it's a really important case from that point of view. The determination to keep these two parts of life apart, the religious education and the secular education on the other, in the religious school would require far too much supervision and oversight. That's exactly what would violate the Establishment Clause. And so the legislation in question is found unconstitutional. And that's where we are. All right, so brief recap. I just want to get this out of the way for now, such that it's a little bit in the background for tomorrow's interaction, such as it shall be. You have the distinction between a subsidy or support for the citizens, the students, the citizens, the parents, whomever, the ordinary taxpayer, and the church or the religious institution on the other. That's a very important distinction. It's perfectly permissible for the state to give support to the citizen or the student who then uses that support in a religious context. And you have this idea of excessive entanglement, that we don't want the government and the religious institution to be too enmeshed with one another. And you certainly don't want too much oversight or supervisory worries. This will come up in the Zobrist case and in other cases when the government has to send a worker into the religious institution, the deaf-mute instruction case, the remedial case, and then there are worries about who's supervising who and so forth. You've got this norm in the background of excessive entanglement that's going to guide the court in the subsequent cases. So that's all I have to say about this now. Not a big deal. I'll see you tomorrow with any luck. Bye for now.